Did anybody see President Obama's speech in Brussels this week? It was an eloquent speech. In many ways, it seemed to me he was conjuring the image of JFK at the Berlin Wall in 1961. Of course, the irony about JFK's speech at the Berlin Wall in 1961 is that the same military-industrial apparatus he was speaking for killed him 2 years later for backing down from an invasion of Cuba and nuclear first strike against the USSR. Publicly executed him in Dealey Plaza. Now, President Obama is a very smart and smooth speaker. He's much more eloquent than the last president, who couldn't put two sentences together. But the mendacity of this speech, the number of falsehoods crammed into one 20-minute speech, were truly incredible. You have to wonder if he really believes what he's saying, what the speechwriter wrote. Doesn't really matter, though, because the President of the United States is, be it for the last more than 100 years, since the late 19th century, is the mouthpiece of big capital, or the CEO of a corporation. And they are responsible, they have to do what the owners of capital say. You know, before that, before the Civil War, they were mouthpieces for the slave owners. But in the late 19th century, they came to represent the big capital, the capitalist monopoly. If it were not so serious, this talk, you could have had a laugh track with it, though. It was, he said about the right-wing demonstrations in Maidan Square in Kiev, he said, there are things that nightsticks and tear gas cannot destroy. Would Occupy Wall Street be one? Or what about everyday life in the black and Latino communities in this country? Or what about the demonstrations in eastern Ukraine against the new right-wing government that are being put down brutally in Donetsk and Kharkov and other working-class centers of East Ukraine? He lumped the end of apartheid in South Africa with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the socialist camp and the freeing of Nelson Mandela, forgetting, never mentioning the U.S. government, the CIA, tracked down Nelson Mandela for the South African security, apartheid security, and that it was the socialist countries of the Soviet Union and East Europe who armed the African National Congress while the United States propped up apartheid. He said that the violent overthrow of Ukraine's elected government was the triumph of hope and freedom. We saw what that hope and freedom means. 2 days ago, the Ukrainian Rada accepted a deal with a loan, a $14 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. And the price of that loan is a 70% wage cut for public sector workers, the reduction of pensions from $160 a month to $80 a month, and elimination of gas and food subsidies. That's the freedom that this U.S.-backed regime has brought to Ukraine. But while that was a triumph and hope and freedom, the people of Crimea have no right to vote to secede, to not accept that, to secede and rejoin Russia. They have no right to exercise their democratic majority vote. In fact, he said that Crimea's rejoining Russia was worse than the U.S. invasion of Iraq, where we didn't go to grab resources. We left, you know, when our job was done. Remember, the U.S. sanctions and bombing in the invasion of Iraq probably killed 2 million people. They destroyed an entire country. Half the country is homeless. Just yesterday, 28 people were killed by a bomb in Baghdad. That's all the consequences of what Washington did there. He referred to peaceful protesters being killed by snipers. And the U.S. media, and it shows what a complete corporate dictatorship this country is, that the U.S. media has not mentioned what's well known everywhere else, the report by the Estonian foreign minister that the same snipers shot both the police and the demonstrators in Kiev, in Maidan Square. And who were they? Who would want to do that? Well, probably, yeah. I think they were used. And he said that there was a UN, and then he justified, he said, well, of course, the U.S. supported Kosovo's separation from Serbia in 1999, but that was because of a UN-supervised referendum. There was never a referendum in Kosovo. There wasn't. It never happened. And, of course, he said, we only came in there, we only started bombing after reports of massive killing. It's true. William Cohen, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, under Clinton, a Republican like Chuck Hagel, said 1 million people may have been murdered in Kosovo before the U.S. started bombing, a completely insane figure. Now William Cohen is a lobbyist for something called the Cohen Group. He's trying to sell U.S. natural gas to West Europe. Anyway, and of course, the president repeated the incredible myth, the complete fabrication that the media has everyone believing that Russia invaded the Ukraine. Invaded Crimea, which never happened. This has not happened. And he said this is not the start of a new Cold War, and that's a huge lie, because the entire object of the exercise of what the United States, of the events the United States has orchestrated in Ukraine, is confrontation with Russia. It is reviving the atmosphere of the Cold War, while the corporate media cheers. First, they funded a violent coup by Russian-hating fascists against an elected government in this former Soviet republic. Then they demand that Russia must recognize this government, and they deny the right of Crimea to secede from Ukraine. And because the Crimean people voted to join Russia, they have engineered the expulsion of Russia from the G20, from the G8, condemnation at the United Nations, and are calling for economic sanctions. Now, Obama's speech was primarily, though, and he said there's no military solution, but it was really aimed at Western Europe. And the demand was that Western Europe join the U.S. in imposing sanctions on Russia, which would mean West Europe cutting off its supply of natural gas and oil. And who could possibly fill that need? East Europe, which has become more under direct U.S. military domination through NATO, is on the regimes there are lined up with Washington and trying to pressure West Europe to do this. And of course, he said it's not. Now, what's driving this seemingly irrational course of action? Provoking a new Cold War, provoking a confrontation with a country that's a nuclear power. The same thing that drove the Bush administration to invade Iraq, which many also said was irrational. And that thing is economic necessity, pressing financial need. Not the pressing need of the millions without jobs or homes, of families whose food stamps have been cut, of those who can't afford medicine or must choose between heating and eating. It's the pressing need of giant banks and corporations to protect their profits and invested capital in the face of a global economic slowdown. I'll return to that in a few minutes, but since we're talking about this Cold War imagery, what was the Cold War? Most of us, I think, grew up with it. And it wasn't all that cold. Millions died in Korea, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, from U.S. bombs and direct and overt wars, or from covert operations in Central America, so-called covert wars in Angola, in Mozambique, in Central America, death squads in South America, Iran, governments overthrown. And how many more millions around the world died of hunger because of the huge, massive military spending? You know, actually one of the most eloquent condemnations of the Cold War was given by none other than one of the people most responsible for it, Dwight Eisenhower, who gave this speech in 1953 to the American Association of Newspaper Editors, where he said, every gun made, it's eloquent. He said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, from those who are cold and not clothed. The world is in arms, is not spending money alone. It's spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hope of its children. He said the cost of one modern heavy bomber is like a brick school in more than 30 cities. You wouldn't know that at the very time he was speaking those words, his planes were raining bombs on Korea. But they were losing that war. Maybe that influenced his words. There were three aspects. The Cold War had three aspects to it. One, it was a war against socialism and war against national liberation. There was, it began after World War II. World War II left much of the world of Europe and Asia, especially in ruins. But for the U.S. capitalist ruling class, not for the hundreds of thousands of GIs who died, but for the U.S. capitalist ruling class, it was the best thing that ever happened to that time, because it left the United States the economically dominant, the destruction of of Europe, of Asia, of the Soviet Union left the United States economically dominant, producing the vast majority of the industrial production of the Western world was in the United States. If you wanted to buy something, you had to buy it from the U.S. You had to borrow money from a U.S. bank to buy it. But there was a problem. It was even better than World War I, which left Europe in debt to the United States. But there was a problem. There was a downside to all this destruction, which was that World War I brought about the Bolshevik Revolution, and World War II, the end of World War II, saw the emergence of a socialist camp, a huge section of the world where a job was a right, where free health care was a right, where housing was a right, where retirement at 50 for women and 55 for men was a right, where daycare was a right, where higher education was free and students got stipends. This had to be destroyed. And for 50 years, the destruction of that camp was the main object of U.S. so-called foreign, they call it policy. It's really imperialism. It's not a policy, it's a system. And perhaps most important, it was a part of the world where the means of production were able to develop free of the restrictions of the world capitalist market, monopoly-dominated world capitalist market, where there was not economic crisis. And the socialist countries not only aided the liberation struggles against colonialism, which at that time still ruled most of Africa and Asia, they also aided development, not only in other socialist countries, but in oppressed countries, even those that were bourgeois states, like India. The first steel plants in India and Iran and Egypt were built by the Soviet Union. The Aswan Dam in Africa was built, in Egypt was built by the Soviet Union. The free education for millions of students from Africa and Asia and Latin America. The socialist planned economy of the Soviet camp even had a stabilizing effect on the world capitalist market. But what capitalist would not eat the goose that lays the golden egg? But in addition to a war against socialism, the Cold War was also a continuation of a war of world conquest that began in 1898 when the U.S. invaded the Philippines. We were just demonstrating today at the Philippine consulate in support of the NDF, National Democratic Front leaders who've been arrested there. It was, in the late 19th century, when capitalism became monopoly capitalism, when banks came to dominate industry and the export of capital became the driving force, the Western Europe and the United States began to carve up the world. And it was not, the war against the socialist camp was not only ideologically driven, it was driven by the same need that drove the U.S. to invade the Philippines in 1898 and China in 1899, to invade Haiti, and as General Smedley Butler said, assist in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. But the Cold War also kept the U.S. as a military superpower at the heart of the capitalist world. With the dollar as its currency and holding most of the Western world's gold. And the U.S. was able to sustain, and actually when Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, that was a huge looting of Washington's own allies in West Europe. And the U.S. was able to sustain the Cold War and this vast level of military spending because they basically were forcing everyone else to pay for it. When they took the dollar off the gold standard in 1973. And anyway, I won't go into the economics of that right now, but the victory in the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, was another great thing for Wall Street, for the bankers. It had the effect of a major war. The drastic fall of life expectancy in the formerly socialist countries of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the shutdowns of plants and factories, the mass unemployment, infant mortality shooting up, all of that destruction, and the U.S.'s share of world output grew for the first time since the 1950s. And it drove down the cost of labor all over the world, you know, and of course, if we want to see how our interests, the interests of the working class are different from those of the ruling class, consider the attacks on labor, on social services, and all the gains that were made. Remember, the gains the working class made in this country in the 30s and the 60s were the products of the global struggle, not the struggle in the U.S. alone. And look what's happened to the working class here since then. But the problem is that the Yeltsin gang, those who overthrew socialism in the USSR, they thought, well, now we're capitalists like you. We'll get a new Marshall Plan. We'll get to sell our products in the West and everything. But no, that wasn't the U.S.'s objective in destroying the USSR. Instead, they got a Roman peace, the kind of peace that was imposed on Germany at the end of World War I. The IMF shut down formerly Soviet industry in repayment for loans. They blocked Russian exports to India and Iran. They expanded NATO into Eastern Europe. In the former USSR, they made war on Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union no longer exists. The Russian Federation is not a socialist state. But the U.S. monopoly capitalist class still wants to destroy it. They want to do to Russia what they've did to Iraq and are trying to do in Syria. Why? Because it's there. The monopoly-dominated world capitalist market is saturated with commodities and capital. It is in a permanent struggle with that crisis unique to the capitalist system, overproduction. Bankers are sitting on trillions of dollars they cannot reinvest at an acceptable rate of profit. It cannot absorb the productive capacity of the vast industrial, scientific, technological apparatus that was left behind, that is the legacy of Soviet power. Just like they cannot absorb the labor power, the minds and capabilities of billions of people, of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world. The world capitalist market has no room for the Eurasian Union, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Shanghai Economic Cooperation, or the rising block of BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which Iran now wants to join. It has no room for the Bolivarian Alliance of the Peoples of Our America, ALBA, or the African Union. The dominant mode of production in all the above-mentioned blocks is capitalist, but their economic center of gravity, the linchpin of their economic and political independence, is the still state-powered economy of the People's Republic of China. And despite the profits U.S. firms make from their investments there, China is the ultimate and inevitable target of the Wall Street Pentagon war drive. That's what the so-called rebalancing to Asia is about. Remember, the biggest problem of capitalism is what? Their nightmare, second only to revolution, is abundance. Too much, not too little, too much. The only system in history, the most productive before socialism, but the only system in human history that falls into crisis when there's too much to go around. When there's enough to go, more than enough, not more than people need, but more than they can sell at a profit. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, and the purpose of monopoly is to restrict supply. And that was true whether it was when John D. Rockefeller was forming the Standard Oil Trust in Ohio in the 1880s and driving small producers out of business, or today when they're trying to cut the gas lines and oil supplies from Russia to Western Europe so the U.S. can have that market. I'll go from the general to the specific. Last October, the Wall Street Journal reported the United States would soon replace Russia as the world's top energy producer. What makes this possible is the trillions of dollars, ultimately, if you figure it all out, that banks and oil corporations have invested in hydraulic fracking of natural gas and oil from shale rock, which is destroying communities around this country. And what made fracking profitable was the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Before war destroyed Iraq's state-owned oil industry, the average price of a barrel of oil was about $25. By mid-2008, a barrel of crude was going for $107. When the tanks rolled into Iraq in March 2003, ExxonMobil and Chevron profits shot up nearly 300% over the previous year. The Iraq War also made profitable the plunder of Canada's tar sands, the Keystone XL pipeline, and the Anglo-U.S.-owned Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which brings gas from former Soviet Central Asia to Europe. It unleashed a bonanza for big oil and for Wall Street. But then the global economic slowdown of 2008 hit and began to drive prices downward. Sanctions and war threats against Iran, the 2011 NATO bombing of Libya, and the CIA-orchestrated war in Syria, which blocks a potential pipeline from Iran to the Mediterranean, have not been enough to stop it. If oil falls below $60, $50 a barrel, this massive investment in fracking will be down the tubes. It will not be profitable. And the banks, Exxon, they will take a terrible loss. Last 2-3 years ago, Exxon bought XTO, which is the world's largest U.S. natural gas fracking company, for $41 billion. It's not just oil companies. General Electric has invested $10 billion in fracking. All that money will be lost if the price of oil. And remember, the oil and natural gas are separate, but they overlap, and their prices go up and down in tandem. Before 1991, the Soviet Union was the world's top energy producer. Much of that production was consumed domestically or provided at low cost to Cuba or free to Cuba and North Korea and other socialist countries. In the 1980s, when the Soviets began building Urengoy 6, which we call the Trans-Siberian gas pipeline, to bring Soviet natural gas to Western Europe, the Reagan administration launched a major campaign to block it and sabotage it. There's an article in Workers' World, A Tale of Two Pipelines, about that if you want to Google it, from 2005. The U.S. wanted to hurt the Soviet Union, of course, but they also wanted to keep West Europe dependent on U.S. energy monopolies who were selling them oil and gas from the Middle East. In 1998, when the Asian financial crisis hit, now capitalist Russia responded by devaluing the ruble, and the oil fell below $11 a barrel. The United States responded with bombs, but the target was not Russia. The target was Iraq. Within 3 months of this collapse of oil prices, the Clinton administration came up with a pretext for a new massive bombing campaign against Iraq, and then the next year they launched the war against Yugoslavia. And of course, the bombing of Iraq intensified the effect of the sanctions. That was 2 years after Madeleine Albright said that the death of 500,000 children from sanctions and bombs was worth it. I guess she means to the oil companies. And that was when the Clinton administration was begging the oil monopolies to build pipelines to Central Asia to cement U.S. influence there. But they were telling him, forget it, unless you can guarantee us that oil will stay above $40 a barrel. And it took the Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003 to guarantee, to drive the prices of oil way above that. And then all these projects began to go through until 2008. But like the restored youth of a vampire who was just gorged on human blood, these benefits are transitory. Soon the monster has to kill again. Hence the crisis in Ukraine, hence the effort to impose sanctions on Russia, hence the war in Syria. It's not only oil and gas involved, military spending. Right now, with the budget crisis so heavy, with cuts in every sector, they're even talking about cutting the military budget. And but a war crisis, expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe to Ukraine, arms sales to Ukraine, and an excuse to avoid cutbacks in the military budget. And finally, there's the question of the dollar itself. Remember, military spending is not only a profit-making for the military corporations, it's also takes a tremendous amount of productive capacity out of production of anything useful. It's a form of destruction itself, you know. We talk about, I just mentioned the crisis of abundance, of overproduction. You know, Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, he asked, how does capitalism escape these crises? By enforced, and this was even in the pre-imperialist stage of capitalism, he said, by more intensive exploitation of existing markets, or enforced destruction of the means of production, of a mass of the means of production. Well, you can look at Detroit, you can look at the factory cities of the United States, you can look at El Barrio, where so many people were once factory workers, where the explosion happened. You know, New York was an industrial town when I was a kid. But even better than shutting down your own factories is blowing up somebody else's. The lesson is that capitalism, in its imperialist monopoly phase, has become an absolute brake on productive forces, as the wars of the 20th and 21st century show. That it needs war and destruction just to survive, just to keep itself, and from the point of view of Wall Street, to keep itself at the center of the world economy. And you know, there's a famous quote from T.J. Dunning that's quoted in the Karl Marx quotes in Capital about how for a certain 300% profit, I don't remember exactly, but most of you probably know it, there is nothing the capitalist will not do the higher the rate of profit, even to the risk of being hanged. And we look at, and he said, smuggling and the slave trade prove all that is written here. We can say poisoning the environment, shutting down industry, and wars of destruction that even imperil, raise the specter of nuclear war, show what the capitalists will do to defend their profits. And it's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of necessity for them. Which means it's a matter of necessity for us to fight against them, to stop them. You know, Russia is no longer socialist, but nevertheless, we can, if they try to tell us that Russia is our enemy, if it were not for the Russian fleet in Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet, the U.S. would probably be at war in Syria right now. So thank you, Russia. And thank you for sheltering Edward Snowden, who revealed the extent that the U.S. government's spying on us. And if it were not for the spying of the Federal Security Bureau, which succeeded the KGB, we wouldn't know that $5 billion had been spent promoting of our tax dollars or dollars they printed have been spent to prop up, to pay off fascist gangs in Ukraine. It's not Russia that's waging war on working class and oppressed people in the United States. Russia did not blow up the pipes in East Harlem. Russia did not devastate Detroit. It's not stealing trillions from our communities for its military. Russian cops are not murdering black and Latino youth or throwing them in the concentration camps. They're not throwing youth in the largest concentration camp in human history, the U.S. prison system. It's the U.S. monopoly capitalist class and its state that are doing that. And the struggle against war has got to be a struggle against them. You know, there's no from Detroit to Crimea, one fight. Thank you. Tonight, I was had organized a demonstration today, and I wasn't really all that prepared. But there's 3 points I want to clarify. One, during the war against Iraq, there was a popular slogan in the anti-war movement. It's very catchy: "No blood for oil." It's a catchy slogan, but I think it's kind of misleading because it might give the impression that the war was fought to get oil for people, because people do need oil. And of course, the people who paid the most for that war were the people of Iraq, whose country was destroyed. But working class and oppressed people in this country paid for it, not only in cutbacks and social services, but at the gas pump, when they had to choose between heating and eating their homes and the price of everything that was driven up by the price of oil and gas that shot up in what was a war to restrict supply, a war not for cheap oil but for expensive oil. Does anyone know the name Debbie Dogskin? She was a Lakota woman who froze to death this winter because the price of propane was too high. And on the Rosebud and Pine Ridge reservations, people were burning their clothes because they couldn't afford propane. That's the price of the Iraq War. That's the price of war in Syria. The price of the war of the situation they're provoking in Ukraine. This is it's a war against the working class and oppressed people all over the world, including here. The oil companies are not in business to provide cheap oil. Also, Obama said there's no military solution, no military way to get Russia out of Crimea in his talk in Europe, and that was for European consumption. But at the same time, the right-wing U.S.-funded militias are massing in eastern Ukraine on the Russian border. I think the possibility of a provocation that would force Russia to respond is very great in an attempt to intensify the crisis. And right now the right sector in Ukraine, it's the name of a right-wing fascist political party, is threatening to blow up Russian gas pipelines. You know, and what the U.S. wants to do is to force Western Europe back into the kind of dependency on the U.S. that it had during the original Cold War. Finally, along with oil and the military, there's the interest of the banks themselves, who actually benefit, or who actually control all these corporations, be it military or energy or whatever. But it goes back to the banks. But the U.S. ruling class has learned that crises and war in other parts of the world flush capital back into the United States, cause capital flight into the United States. That happened during the Iraq wars, during the Yugoslav war, when they looked like they were attacking Syria, the dollar shot up. When it looked like, when the crisis in Ukraine was at its height, the dollar shot up. And so this is sort of a way, war overseas as a way to shove up the value of the dollar and reduce the deficit without raising interest rates. It's that's part of its effect because it drives capital into this country. And basically the problem the U.S. faces is how to keep Wall Street at the center of the world economy when there are so many other potential centers right now, and technology and the means of production have developed so much around the world, in large part because of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Chinese Revolution and the socialist camp, which, even though it no longer exists, it opened the door for development in many parts of the world that imperialism was strangling.